Hi and welcome back to the Spare Time Shop. I'm Ruben and I've been working in this space for about a year now. And up until now that was mostly from the floor or some sawhorses. But I recently purchased this small table saw and I'd like to make things more organized. So I'm planning on building a big work table with the new table saw integrated. The workbench is entirely made up out of plywood sheets and wood beams. Now let's start with taking those and cutting them to length to create table legs. Alright, now I got the legs cut to length and I'm planning to screw them together in an L shape like this to provide more stability in both directions for the table. But if I were to screw them together, as they are, these rounded edges would leave a pretty big seam. And I don't really like that, so I'm going to cut one end of each board to remove the rounded edges. It's worth noting that this is an unnecessary step. I'm just very excited to use this table saw for the first time. I'm using a lot of wood glue and 120mm wood screws because these crossed pieces will need to be as strong as possible and not flex or bend when I put a heavy piece on top of the workbench. Now let's bring out the plans to make the next step a bit more logical to follow. I'm building a torsion box for the top of the workbench. Let's begin with the sides of the box that have these holes. A torsion box workbench is basically using a big plywood box instead of a thick slab of solid or laminated wood. It greatly reduces the weight of the workbench, and by cutting strips for the sides of the box, all the same width, the top should stay perfectly flat when assembled. Since a torsion box is pretty much an empty box, it has a lot of unused space. And that's why I'm cutting out these openings in the sides so the box opens up and I can use the inside for storage. Now I've seen some other woodworkers do the same thing and it just makes sense. I've made a template to trace the design for the openings, and this pill shape is strongly inspired by the workbench design from Ron Paulk. So be sure to go check him out if you don't already know about him. I'm cutting out the shapes with a jigsaw, but staying close to the line. Now the jigsaw leaves some blowout on the plywood, so to smooth out the edges, I'm coming back with a router with a flush trim bit and following the template to make all the shapes exactly the same. Now this is also an unnecessary step, but since I'll be using this workbench a lot, I like the edges to be crisp and straight. And I'm also rounding over all the edges to make sure they are splinter free. Alright, now I got all the upright pieces cut and I made the holes in them. So it's time to assemble the whole thing so I can make a structure that goes on top of the bottom panel of the torsion box. I'm using a drill guide to help drill the countersunk holes for the screws, because I'm screwing into the end faces of the plywood, so there is very little room for error. Again, using wood glue for a strong joint and checking for square on all the pieces. Alright, now with the core of the torsion box assembled, it's time to screw on the bottom panel. Now you can see the plywood is a bit warped, but when screwing this onto the core of the box, it should be pulled flat. I'm cutting out a hole for the table saw at the back of the panel. Now the size of the torsion box is just a little bit smaller than a standard plywood sheet. So I'm centering the sheet onto the core with just a bit of overhang on all sides and using this spacer block to make sure it's all the same on each side. After screwing the bottom panel onto the core, I'm coming back with a flush trim bit on the router to clean up all the overhanging edges and squaring up the panel in the process. With the bottom panel screwed onto the frame, it already feels a lot more sturdy. And this is the underside where I left a big hole for the table saw. Now the next thing to do is fabricate a box so the table saw will sit flush with the top surface. It'll make sense in a moment. I'm cutting some pieces as sides for the recessed box where the table saw will sit into. And to mount the bottom panel at the right height, I cut some spacer pieces that fall just below the table saw top. Now just to double check, yes, the table saw will sit proud just a little bit above the workbench top. You would want it this way and not the other way around, or the pieces that you push through the table saw will hit the workbench top, and that would be pretty dangerous. So I centered the plywood top on the base, and the next thing I need to do is cut a big hole for the table saw to fit in. I also need to cut a big slot across the top so the table saw fence can slide back and forth. You can see that the arms of the fence go pretty far back, so these will need all the room they can get. And by cutting out a slot on the tabletop and cutting out the box walls, this should be plenty. I'm not yet screwing the tabletop onto the box. I first need to assemble the legs under the box. So let's connect the legs to each other and create a solid base for the top to sit on. I'm adding these extra support pieces because I want to add a big shelf into the frame. And this piece of plywood will sit just above the floor, giving me the most possible extra storage underneath the workbench. Alright, so the base is now finished and it's really sturdy. So the only thing left to do now is to take the base, put it on the ground, and then take the top and put it on the base. So let's do some heavy lifting. And you can see now why I didn't screw the top on just yet. So now I can easily get into the box to connect it to the base with these big truss head screws. With the box screwed onto the base, I can mount the tabletop. Now I'm marking where all the upright walls are so I know where to put the screws.
Alright, now with the tabletop installed on the base, the whole thing is really strong. The only thing left to do now is trim all the excess edges of the top, sand everything down and then fit the table saw.
The table saw has this handle that I want to cover up. So I traced the shape and cut it out of a plywood piece to fit. And with some sanding and a little bit of cleanup, the workbench is ready to be finished. I got these retractable casters from Amazon, and installing is pretty straightforward. You just screw them onto the sides of the legs. And what's cool about them is that they can be lifted up so the table legs touch the ground, and that way the workbench won't move. Because with normal casters, the table always sits on top of its wheels, making it a little bit wobbly. So now I've got an easily movable workbench, with a lot of room to put my tools to help keep the tabletop clean. And there are even some compartments to put the table saw accessories. These are empty spaces. I was just planning on throwing the accessories from table saw in them, but I will still leave them open to fill up with dust. So I'm planning on using some scrap pieces and I will build some drawers. Now these drawers are nothing more than some plywood pieces glued and nailed together. And I didn't want to add any hardware that sticks out, so for the drawer pulls I just cut a recess that fits my hand.
Alright, now I've got to be honest, and there's actually one mistake I made while building the table. And that has everything to do with the dust extraction from the table saw. You see, I left this big opening right here, thinking I would just feed the hose from the vacuum through it to the table saw, but the vacuum hose I have is actually smaller than the table saw exhaust, so I need to use this adapter piece. And while building the workbench, I completely forgot about this piece. So let me show you, it actually sticks out way further than I thought. Now I could just go ahead and drill a big hole right here in the back panel of the table, just to feed the adapter piece through and let the hose connect to it straight on. But that actually would be a little bit of a shame, The better solution would be if this adapter piece immediately took a 90-degree turn to the right. Then the hose could sit alongside the back panel and I don't have to cut any holes. Now I'm sure that adapter pieces like that do exist, but I don't really want them to ship to me all the way across the globe just for my stupid mistake. So I actually measured this one out and 3D modeled and printed one that fits better to the table. So as you can see, these both have similar outer diameters to fit into the table saw. But this one immediately takes a 90-degree turn. And the other end is actually also bigger than my vacuum hose. That's because I made it that way to fit this rubber ring. Now hopefully this rubber ring will help prevent air loss from the vacuum. So let's see if this one fits. And because I don't want to crawl underneath the table every time I'm going to connect the vacuum to the table saw, I made an extra piece that I'll mount on the inside of the workbench. And then I'll connect a short piece of the vacuum hose in between these two adapter pieces.
It's worth noting that this should not be an issue if you got a bigger hose on your shop vac and won't need this adapter piece. Now with the short piece of hose in between the table saw and the side of the table, I can now put the vacuum into the side of the table with a nice snug fit. The hose has some extra room to flex, so it stays connected when turning the saw blade 45 degrees. I switched out the blade for a finer one to start fresh on some new projects. And I've already built some pretty big projects on this table. As you can see, it doesn't budge one bit, even when I'm standing on it. And the big worktop doubles as a long outfeed table, which is ideal for ripping up long beams like this one.
So we're a couple months in and I've been using this workbench a lot lately. I'm pretty happy with it, but there's just one thing that I didn't think all the way through, and I've noticed it while using it. Now that's why I usually wait a little with posting these videos until I get to test all the things that I build. Well, and I'm pretty slow at editing, but let me show you what could be improved on this design. So if you want to adjust the fence, you can turn this knob right here and the fence goes back and forth. But if you want a wider range of motion, you can take this fence apart and mount it again a little bit further along these tracks. Now to do this, you have to open these two levers, and as you can see, this one is blocked by the tabletop behind it. So no matter how far you pull the fence, this lever always gets stuck behind the table edge. Now there is a simple solution to get to this lever, and that's just to lift the whole table saw out of the bench. But that would require me to loosen this panel right here, because the table saw is actually hooked underneath it. So I'm just thinking about cutting half a circle out of here so the latch can open all the way without me disassembling anything.
I'm marking half a circle where the lever stops and cut it out of the tabletop. And to finish the hole I just made, I glued a piece of plywood to the inside and routed out the axis. And now the lever can open without lifting up the table saw. After using the workbench for a couple of weeks, I quickly decided to make a crosscut sled. I'll keep it short as there are plenty good videos on how to build this on YouTube already. Now you start with screwing together a sled, the size is completely up to you, and then cutting strips that fit the miter slots perfectly. Putting them in the tracks and adding some super glue on the top. Then dropping the sled onto the worktop while using the fence as a guide to make sure the sled and the tracks are square. And you can screw the tracks in place once everything's all lined up nicely. Now to be able to push the sled past the blade, I did have to rat out some grooves in the tabletop. And these don't have to be too deep, just enough for the sliders to pass through. And a little side note again, if you don't want a crosscut sled, you don't have to do this step. Although I highly recommend making one because it's pretty damn useful. So now it's time to make the first cut. I'm raising the blade to cut through the bottom panel of the sled for the very first time. And this part is always a little bit exciting. Alright, looking good so far. Now let's try a little test piece. Now let's check if it's square. Yup, looks good to me. We have a working table sled. And that's it. The workbench is fully finished and ready to be used.
So overall, I'm really happy with this new workbench. It has a nice flat tabletop, a lot of storage underneath, and it adds a lot of functionality to an otherwise empty workshop. I always wanted a table saw and now I've got one that's nicely integrated, and I can use this one to build out future projects. And with the retractable casters underneath, I can't complain that this thing will be ever in my way. I can just push it aside. So if you have any questions about this design or how to build this workbench, please let me know in the comments below. And as always, thanks for watching and I'll see you in the next one. Bye bye.